It is a residential treatment centre. It's not the fix, it's not a cure. It is hopefully the beginning of a process. It's so important for people to own the problem, first of all, to accept that they're where they've got to in their lives. Family members may not necessarily recognise how they have been damaged themselves by being around someone. That their whole way of life has had to be adjusted to accommodate the reality of addiction in their midst.
I've had a gambling addiction when I was about 18, and then I was just in this cycle of constantly losing and trying to chase it back, losing and trying to chase it back.
Yeah. And when you mix actually the two, you introduce a new substance, cocaethylene, which is a mixture of the alcohol and the cocaine. And he was dealing in drugs in order to feed his own habit. I remember going to her wake where she got to the point where she couldn't live and she took her own life. Poof. That's hit me.
Welcome back to Life in Depth. I'm Ryan McDade. I have Stephen McLaughlin from Derry, who is the Director of Clinical Services today. He talks about the struggles of people who are dealing with addiction. He's someone who helps them through the recovery, taking responsibility, but also the challenges that comes along with it. I found it very insightful, and it was good to get a glimpse into what it's like helping people deal with recovery. I hope you enjoy. Stephen, welcome to the Life in Depth. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm interested because you're the Director of Clinical Services at the White Oaks Rehab Centre, and I reached out to White Oaks because I was curious about hearing the work that's been done there. It's in the local area, and I know something a lot of people struggle with is addiction. And I just wanted to get an idea about the work that's been done there.
Yeah, it's I suppose where do we start with it? It's just actually there 2 days ago was the 4th anniversary of the death of Father Neil Carlin, that a lot of people would perhaps have heard about because he was the person that founded White Oaks, a man from Fawn and a few other places. So it was founded by him and members of the Columba community, which is a faith community based around Derry and Donegal. Opened the doors around 2001 of White Oaks itself. And it is a residential treatment centre. So the basic purpose of White Oaks is to provide people with the opportunity to come and address their addiction issues in a residential setting. A lot of people struggle with addiction of one kind or another, whether it's alcohol or drugs or gambling. Maybe have tried different things over the years, and usually if none of those other things seems to be working and the problems persisting, then they will either themselves or through referral come to us. But we always emphasize that coming to a place like White Oaks for 4 weeks residential treatment it's not the fix, it's not a cure. It is hopefully the beginning of a process that enables a person then to, get on with their lives by addressing their addiction, but doing so with support. We stress the fact that you will continue long after you leave White Oaks. You will continue to need support because that's the nature of recovery from addiction. It's a collective approach. I suppose going back to the like of AA, people go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting and it's peer to peer. It's one person helping the other. And that's also very much at the heart of what we do in White Oaks. The treatment there involves a number of things. I suppose the most important aspect is what we call group therapy. So twice a day, morning and afternoon, the 12 people or whatever number that are there, they participate in a session of group therapy in the morning and the evening, and it's led by a counsellor. But what you're trying to do is get people to open up, share with each other, help each other, challenge each other, And in that way, you kind of break open the secrecy of addiction and the shame and all of those things that are attached to a problem with alcohol or drugs. And that part of it is probably the most important. There's also individual counselling. There's talks and lectures, and there's things like mindfulness, and we do other little bits like yoga and drama therapy. But the core, from my point of view anyway, and I think the evidence around the world would say that if people go into any kind of residential centre, it's the group aspect which is really key. So I've been there 13 years as the clinical manager or director of clinical services. And we're a small team, the counsellors, the admin, and kitchen staff and housekeeping. But it's a real privilege from my point of view. It's a job that quite often people say to me, it must be stressful and all of that, which it is. But thankfully, to date anyway, I've never found myself going into work in the morning with any sense of dread or not wanting to be there. Because to me, it's a privilege that someone comes into a place like that and they're willing to trust what you do. They're willing to trust the people there, to open up, to share stuff that's really difficult and painful. And, not only the individual who comes in, but also their families as well, because they're a big part of it. So I see it as a privilege to be able to be entrusted with that kind of work by people on a daily basis. And, people move through us after 4 weeks. They go on. We have an aftercare program to support them for 2 years. And we've got a lot of voluntary help as well involved. Many people who've gone down the road of recovery will often feel that need to give back. So a big part of if you want to call it the success of a place like White Oaks, and I'm sure it applies in other treatment centres as well, is the input that comes from volunteers and people who want to try to help others. So yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I don't want to say I've been enjoying it, but I feel very, very kind of privileged.
Yeah.
To be there.
What does the process look like for someone starting out at White Oaks? Do they come to the centre drunk?
Okay.
How does it?
No.
How does one bring themselves there? Are they bringing themselves there, or is it like family members bringing them there? Or?
Well, it can be a mixture. I sometimes find myself saying that nobody walks in the door of White Oaks jumping for joy. They're not leaping in the door enthusiastic. If someone has to come to a place like White Oaks, usually it's because their life is in crisis. And, someone said to me a long time ago that the word crisis in Greek stands for both crisis as we would normally understand it, but in Greek it also means opportunity. So they come because they want something better. They come because they're in pain, they're suffering, their family are suffering. So when we receive people either who come directly to us themselves, they've lifted the phone, they've asked for help, or they've maybe been working with an addiction counsellor in the community, say in the HSE, their doctor perhaps has referred them. So they may have had some preparatory work done elsewhere before they come to us. Or in some cases, they'll come to us pretty raw. Now, the one thing that we require of everyone is they can't turn up at our door not drunk or high or that way. They have to come for assessment first of all, and they must be able to present themselves as reasonably stable. Because there's no point in sitting down to do an assessment with someone if they're heavily intoxicated, because they're not capable of engaging with you. So they come and get assessed, and then once the assessment is completed, usually then you're able to give them a date for admission. How long people have to wait depends really on the demand, and that varies from week to week or maybe month to month. Usually, people from the time that they get assessed would have to wait for maybe 4-5 weeks, but that can be pushed out sometimes to 6-7 weeks or more. Once they come into us, and they have to be, as I said, stable. We do drug tests and alcohol tests and stuff like that. Once they come into us, they begin the program, but it's a rolling program. So people that are in the place are at different stages. So there's some people who are maybe in their last few days of treatment. There's others then just beginning. But once they come in, it's a timetabled type of activity, if you like, in the sense that there's a structure to the day. And that's important because a lot of people who've been living in the midst of addiction, their life has been in chaos. There's been no structure, no order, no routine. And the one thing that sometimes they need and maybe deep down they crave is to have routine, to know, well, it's time to get up. It's time to go and sit down and eat food. So we have a timetable from like 7 in the morning and various things in the early part of the day. It's just routine stuff. And then we get people into the business of mindfulness or meditation. We give them a little taste of that each morning. And that's really to try and equip people with tools that are going to help them in the long run. You know, because the idea of meditation, mindfulness, is to try to get you more grounded in your life.
I assume that there's no phones or the
Oh yeah, no, they don't have access to
no
phones,
computers,
social
no
media,
internet or nothing.
none of that stuff. No, that's taken away. But the remarkable thing, you know, is that no one really misses it. In fact, when they're about to finish and leave us and getting their phones back, they're almost afraid to switch them on again because they realize just how much of a gift it has been to be able to be free of all that stuff. And then, as I say, the structure of the day then, as I mentioned, is the group therapy twice a day. There's lectures both in the morning and the evening. And then they would also maybe twice a week have individual counselling with a one-to-one with a counsellor. There's input from their family. We do what's called CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy. We do a session or a workshop of that each week. And other bits and pieces. We have groups like AA and NA also coming into the centre. Those are people who, if you like, sharing their experiences, trying to encourage people on the journey of recovery. So it's quite a mix and it's quite intensive. And for people, particularly someone who's been living fairly chaotically, initially it can be a bit daunting. You know, just getting used to that routine, being thrown in with other people. I remember funny one time, it was a youngish lad, he was only maybe in his early 20s, and he came in and he just arrived in and it was lunchtime. So everybody gathered down in the dining room and they were sitting at, as they do, there's maybe 4 at a table. And he came in, I could see he was sort of bewildered, and he sat down at the table and he put his arms on the table and he looked around him and he said, "What do you do here?" And I says, "Well, this is lunchtime, you get food." "But do you sit like this here?" And I says, "Yeah, this is what's called sitting, having a meal and talking to people." And I suppose it's what struck me was just how weird and unusual that was for him, because whatever his background was, he wasn't used to that. And I suppose it also flags up an important thing in addiction, which is that a lot of people caught up in addiction are very isolated in their lives. You know, if you think about it, if someone is drinking very heavily or using drugs or stuff like that, it usually gets to the point where they don't want to be with anyone. They withdraw, retreat into their own little world, be it their bedroom or somewhere else, and they become very isolated. So coming into a place like White Oaks, which is a communal environment, there's other people, there's 12 usually in treatment, and there's staff, etc. It's kind of a shock to the system that you're actually around people. But the vast majority of people warm to that and actually get to enjoy it. But it takes a wee bit of getting used to at the start for some.
Mm. So I'm assuming then that the things that they come in dealing with are there's shame around that. They're embarrassed that they're going to rehab.
Yeah, it varies from person to person. You will get, I suppose, people who have maybe seemingly functioned in their lives. So what I mean is someone who's a mum or a dad, they've got kids, they've got a job, they've got a home, and to the outside world they look as if they're okay. But then they have this secret problem of either drinking heavily or using drugs like cocaine or whatever it may be. And so for them, having to acknowledge that the problem has developed into a crisis can be a source of shame. They don't want anyone to know. And, they almost maybe come in with the attitude, well, I'll go in there, I'll hide away for 4 weeks, and I'll come out and it'll be okay, and I'll just get on with my life. And that usually doesn't work, because it's so important for people to own the problem, first of all, to accept that they're where they've got to in their lives, to accept what it's done to them, to accept how it's affected their family, their children, or people around them. And that doesn't mean they've got to, broadcast it to the whole world, but it's important that somehow rather, if they're burdened by a sense of shame or carrying a sense of stigma about it all, that they begin to deal with that. That they begin to, first of all, understand that, first of all, nobody sets out to become addicted to anything. It's not as if a person has chosen this particular lifestyle. It has developed slowly over time. And there may be a multitude of factors that have maybe influenced where they've got to. It may be family background, it may be trauma, but there's usually no one single reason. And I suppose what's important from our point of view is trying to enable a person to look at their feelings of shame about all of this and to accept themselves. It's about trying to encourage a person to accept where they've got to, that this isn't about failure or being inadequate, but this is simply just what has developed in their life. And to acknowledge also, you are now beginning to do something about it. You're taking a courageous step. It's not easy. And, that you can then, with the help of others, begin to become more comfortable with the fact that this is a condition that I'm dealing with. So, it's a gradual process in that sense, where you're hoping to bring people to a point where they're certainly not going to be, in a sense, handicapped by feelings of shame and stigma and all the secrecy that goes around it. But you're also doing that to some extent with their family as well, because family members may also worry about what the neighbours think. They don't want to let people know, and that's understandable. But when you think about the environment that we all live in the Ireland, say, of today, we live in a culture where access to alcohol, drugs, gambling, it's so available that it's not any big surprise that some people are going to become casualties in the midst of all of that. So rather than people, if you like, pointing fingers at others, I think a lot of us at times are probably better served by saying, there, but I for the grace, or no, there go I, but for the grace of God, or whatever way you want to put it. That I'm fortunate it hasn't developed in my life, and I have to be proactive about how I look after myself. So when people are around others who are dealing with the issue, that very often helps to melt away the sense of shame and stigma.
Mm. I also feel like a lot of it's changing in the sense like there's the stigma around it isn't like it would have been maybe like 10 years ago and then 20 years ago. Like people are coming around to the idea, okay, like some people have problems and it's good that they're dealing with it. I think the more that we do that, the easier it becomes for other people to, I suppose, be just more accepting of it.
Very much so, yeah. You know, we are all aware of, say, prominent people, be it in sort of social media or be it influencers or celebrities or whatever. A lot of people who've been very successful in their lives have also had to acknowledge they've had a problem and have owned it and come out with that, which again helps to demystify it and helps to kind of dissolve that stigma. And I think the understanding, yes, as you say, our understanding has developed. In years gone by, for example, you know, when you think again, the Ireland going back, well, a long time ago, Ireland had these big mental hospital institutions, you know, in the big provincial towns like Letterkenny or Sligo, or you go into most of those big towns, you see these big grey buildings where people were locked up. And very often that's where addiction was dealt with as well. Um, Today, thankfully, there's a more enlightened approach to it. And it's still seen, if you like, along with the mental health, because the two can be difficult to untangle. If a person, for example, is struggling with depression or trauma, or has, you know, particularly, say, developmental trauma from childhood, that may have led them into using drugs or drinking as a way of just coping. And the two things kind of get messed up together, if you like, the mental health issue and the addiction. So we today understand or have a better understanding of it, and therefore the response to it today um, is hopefully more enlightened, so that it's not just about a person leaving a bottle to the one side or getting off drugs. It's about personal growth and development. It's about, you know, living a life that is fuller and richer, and finding other ways of being able to enjoy life. Um, so, you know, a lot of people that I'm aware of, for example, get into physical health, get into, you know, going out in the outdoors, doing other things, get into other kind of creative things. And those kind of activities are an essential part of helping to build up your own personal resilience, and improve your mental health. And that in turn will also help a person who's trying to get into recovery.
Mm.
You know, so there's no sort of silver bullet answer to it all. There's a number of different things that are required. But above all, I think that what a person will look for, or perhaps need most of all, is human understanding and company, and acceptance. So therefore, any sort of sense of stigmatizing is counterproductive and is very destructive, in fact, you know.
So why is it that like rehab is needed for some of them people? Why are they not able to like do that on their own?
Mm.
What are the challenges that get in the way of that?
I suppose life. Um, Rehab gives people a space and a bit of time to take them out of the normal stuff of life. So, for example, if you are in a relationship, you've got a partner, you've got kids, you have a job, you've got those immediate pressures, which can make it difficult for you to address your drinking or your drug use, because you're on that treadmill of trying just to keep going from day to day, and you're hoping that the problem will go away. And you might go and talk to someone, you might go to an AA meeting, but you're coming home and you've got to deal with stuff. And if you're in an environment where the stuff is very accessible, if you've got friends around you, or people around you that are going to provide you with, say, the drugs or whatever it may be, it's hard to kind of pull yourself away So when you go into rehab, you're kind of removing yourself from your normal environment, and you're giving yourself that bit of space and time just to first of all put your feet on the ground, to breathe, to feel, and to start to consider, how can I look after myself? What do I need? What really deep down do I need if I'm going to be a happier human being? So, that's what rehab is about. It it helps you also to understand the way that you think. Today, as I mentioned there earlier, we use the like of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really about understanding how my thoughts affect how I feel, and my feelings then usually influence my behavior. So when you begin to kind of look at that, what way have I been thinking about things? What way do I think about myself? And you begin to challenge those. You step back from yourself in a sense, and you're able then to see things a little bit more clearly. But it's very hard to do that kind of work if you're still going home in the evening, or you've got the off license around the corner, or you've got pressure from your boss, or whatever it may be. Uh, so rehab is about being with other people who are on the same journey. It's about, yes, it's not a spa, a luxury spa where you sit back and kind of pamper yourself. Um, it is quite intensive because it's asking questions of you, but at the same time, it's also supportive because there's people around you who will listen. And, whether it's a mixture of at times having to tell someone, basic home truths in a very direct way, or at times where it's a kind of putting an arm around someone's shoulder and allowing them that wee bit of space just to express what they're feeling. Um, Rehab kind of gives people that opportunity. And it also means, in our setting, they they also have to listen to their family because, twice or two Thursdays out of the 4 weeks that they're there, we invite family members to come in, be it their partner, be it their son, daughter, whoever. And that person's coming in, and we're saying to them, tell me about your father or your sister or your mother or whoever. Tell me what it's been like to be around that person. What's it been like for you? What have you experienced? How do you feel about that? And when you have to sit and listen to that firsthand, that in itself can be it can kind of turn a key in some people's lives, whereby maybe for the first time they've actually had to listen and they've been receptive, and there's nowhere to run, there's no way to deflect it. You've had to listen and have to absorb it, and that's where you hope that the process of therapy begins to work. So, you know, there are some people who, I'm not saying everyone who has an issue with alcohol or drugs has to come into residential treatment. It's not for everyone. Other people may find other routes. But for those who have been struggling, um, it often is the beginning of something that they can build on. Um, and if they take it forward, if they continue the process, if they engage with what we call aftercare, then, you know, the growth that they've started continues, and they've an awful lot more work to do on themselves, of course. 4 weeks is not going to do it all.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I can't imagine. You talked about the people who are dealing with addiction. One of the things is like they isolate themselves. So I assume with isolation comes, whether it be go to the bedroom and or wherever that is, maybe they go to the bar, maybe
out to the shed, out the
whatever
back.
that is. So they're isolating themselves, but I assume that they're isolating their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions. So how does that change in rehab? Because I assume they're still going to come with that form of isolation from themselves, or isolating. You know?
Yeah, very much so. I suppose they can come into rehab. A lot of people labouring under a lot of distortions, in their thinking. Their thinking's distorted simply because of maybe years and years of drinking, where um, they've been doing that, and then they've also maybe attracted to themselves a lot of negativity because they've been hurting people close to them. And naturally, when family get angry because they're hurt, they direct that anger at the individual. So that feeds that negativity that the person feels about themselves. They probably feel a sense of failure as a person, that they look perhaps at their peers. I'm thinking of a guy recently saying to me, he was in his probably late 30s, early 40s, bright guy, gone to college, all that kind of stuff. And yet, for the last 7 or 8 years, has been kind of caught up in addiction. And one of the difficult things for he had a good circle of friends, but he was avoiding those friends because they were a reminder to him and his terms at how much he had failed, because they had moved on in their careers. They were successful, they were building houses, they were doing all these things. He felt an awful sense of failure because he wasn't doing the same, and so he avoided them. So, in terms of dealing with the sense of which a person may be locked into their own thoughts and their own feelings about themselves, coming into rehab gives a person space and time to have those, if you like, thoughts and feelings examined, ventilated, challenged, so that when they're with other people, quite often the first thing people will say when they come in initially and they listen to other people is, what you've just said, God, that's so much like what I've experienced. So they identify with each other, and there's a great power in that, because they thought perhaps they were the only person in the world going through this. But when they listen to someone else, they realize, they're not on their own here. This isn't all that abnormal. That brings them out, and then just being around each other over the space of the few weeks, but then working with a counsellor in the whole task of therapy, even doing individual counselling. What are you doing? You in a sense, as a counsellor, are holding a mirror up to someone. You're taking what they're saying, and you're trying to reflect that back to them in a way that perhaps they can understand and see things more clearly. You're trying to enable them to understand the way that they think and how that affects then how they feel about themselves. And you're also in some ways conveying to them the importance of questioning that, and beginning then to see that deep down behind the addiction and behind all of the crazy behaviors that goes along with it at times, there is a human being there who's a good-hearted human being. He or she, yes, is capable of doing sort of bad things and hurtful things, but when the person deals with the addiction, they begin to come back to a new appreciation of themselves. And, on the journey of recovery, they begin to get to know themselves in a way that they have never done before. Again, I'm thinking of someone recently. I suppose I think in terms of people. A man in his maybe late 40s, not married, lived with his parents. Parents have died a few years ago, and it was alcohol. But he talked about waking up at 6 in the morning, curtains pulled, reaching for the can at the bottom of the bed, and the bleakness of that whole picture. And he said, I don't. He says, and he was off alcohol prior to coming into us. He's actually been off alcohol for maybe 5 or 6 months beforehand. So he hadn't been drinking, but he said, I didn't know myself at all. I didn't know what it was to feel. I didn't know what it was to feel anything. I was going around, and he says, I feel like I'm almost beginning to waken up out of a daze, and that I'm now beginning to deal with life. That this is life. Now, he was also at the same time saying, I'm fearful that I'll be able to do this. So, he's still in the early stages and he has those bits of self-doubt, which is very normal and understandable. But that's where addiction takes people in the sense of isolation, that not only do they disconnect from their family or friends, but they actually disconnect from themselves. They don't know what it is. They don't know what they feel because they've been numbing out their feelings for so long that has become the norm for them. So therapy and any kind of rehabilitative work is really about trying to help that person to reconnect with themselves. And that can only happen if their mind is not altered by drugs or drink.
Mm.
That's the first base they've got to get to.
Yeah.
Because there's no point in trying to get in touch with yourself if you're putting substances into your body and into your mind that are going to alter your way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, that first base can be the struggle for a lot of people. And the kind of people who, I'd have heard people saying who would be kind of strong advocates of the like of AA, that when they got into recovery at the start, what they did was they went to 90 meetings in 90 days. So in other words, each day religiously they went to a meeting and they just stuck at it until they got to a certain stage where they felt at least they were a bit more confident about themselves and managing.
Mm. So something else that comes up then, it's like responsibility, taking responsibility for, I suppose, everything that has happened to bring you to that point. How do you help people realize that, taking responsibility is key to change?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things. I suppose one of the areas would be when family come in and when they have to listen to their family. Or what we also do, for example, is we ask family members or friends to fill out a questionnaire. So the questionnaire really is asking people to say, well, again, what's it been like to be around this person? How have you been affected? How do you feel about it? So they actually write that a questionnaire out, and then that's brought into the group therapy process, and it's read out. So if you're the person who's been spoken about or has been written about, and there's 10 or 11 or whatever number of people and the counsellor there listening to that, you're right away being challenged about your behaviour, what you've done, how people have been affected. For example, if there's young children involved, how they've been affected, what we call hidden harm. So when a person starts to deflect away from that and saying things like, it wasn't as bad as that, or but she did worse, or that only happened once, or whatever it may be, that's where they get called out by their own peers. And in that sense, what they're actually doing is they're encouraging them to take responsibility, and they're saying to them, listen, no point in excuses. Don't run. Don't hide. Face what you're doing. And I suppose in a broader sense, trying to get people to take responsibility is what we would say, for example, to family members is, we talk about, I think it's called the 3 C's. We would say to a family member, you didn't cause the addiction, you cannot control it, and you cannot cure it. So if you're the husband, the wife, or the mother, or whatever, of whoever it is that's caught up in addiction, it's important that you don't try to continue to rescue that person or cover up for them, and all of that. In every way, everything from, washing their clothes and giving them food and making excuses for them, that you back in some ways, that you step back. And in that way, you're handing responsibility for their recovery back to them. And that's very important. I suppose people talk about it as boundaries, setting boundaries. So that if you've got the issue of addiction, if I care about you, I'll help you if you're doing something positive, and I'll support you if you're doing something positive. But I can't do it for you. And therefore, it's your responsibility. And I suppose it's just all the time, in a sense, repeating that message, and hammering it home. But in other ways, responsibility is brought home to people when they have to, you know, go up to court because they've been caught drink driving, and they've got to deal with it. Or if their partner has moved out and said, right, I can't handle this anymore, or there's financial problems, they've got to deal with these things. And all of that, if they're dealing with them in a sober head, or, where they're not under the influence of something or other, then I think that's where responsibility begins to bite. But it's also a very empowering for a person, those steps that they have to take. They begin to realize that they can deal with these things. And it helps to build their own sense of, or their own confidence and resilience. So taking responsibility is hugely important in that sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's funny when you're talking, like, I hear you talking about family and their partners, their kids, and like addiction doesn't just, yes, it affects the person who has the addiction, but there's a lot of other, the family that they're dealing with addiction, even though if they're not the one that has it. And I suppose it's a process for everyone, which isn't something that I have given a lot of thought to. But now that you've shared, it seems like they're having to go through and do the work with them.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when we do have family members coming in on a Thursday, as I say, we do a little talk with them. And one of the things I would often say is, look, you probably have come here today to support the person who's in treatment, and you're probably relieved that they're here, because that's often what people will say to you. A family member will say, at least I know where they are and they're safe, and I can sleep tonight in my bed. But you might be thinking, well, as long as he or she stops drinking and drugging, I'll be all right, I'm okay. And family members may not necessarily recognize how they have been damaged themselves by being around someone, that their whole way of life has had to be adjusted to accommodate the reality of addiction in their midst. So, for example, in concrete terms, what that means is, if you're a partner of someone who's caught up in addiction, you've got used to the idea that you can't rely on them. If they say they're going to be home at 8 o'clock tonight, you've got used to the idea that could disappear for maybe a few days, and you don't know where they are. So you're worried, and you're making phone calls, and you're stressed out by it. And in the meantime, you've got to look after the normal things of life, like family and children and whatever. You've got used to, maybe for some people, the chaos, so that you've got used maybe to guards coming to the door looking for someone, or because there's been some kind of disturbance. You've got used to the fact that bills haven't been paid, so you discover that, I always remember a woman coming in to talk about, was her husband was in with us for a gambling addiction, and I think alcohol, but he had run up a lot of debt, hadn't been paying the mortgage, and this kind of suddenly exploded in her life when she got a letter out, or however she discovered. And, I remember her describing going to the bank or wherever it was, the building society, to try to sort the problem out with her husband. And she's up at the counter talking to someone, and he's sitting down below. And when she turns around and looks, he's on his phone, gambling. And she's up at the counter trying to save their house. What that does to people, what that takes out of people, they don't always recognize, because they're trying to just cope from day to day. So when family members come into us, we first of all try to enable them to recognize how they've been affected, and how important it is that they begin to take care of themselves. And of course, that's even more the case when there's young children involved. I've often the phrase or the phrase I sometimes use as regards children is, look, we get a second chance at a lot of things in life. You know, if you don't like your job, you can change it. If you don't like where you live, you can move somewhere else. If you don't even like your partner or who you're going to live, you can change. The one thing you cannot get a second chance at in life is childhood. You come that journey once. And whatever you've experienced in those formative years as a child or as a young person growing up, you cannot years later on go back and make it all good, because childhood happens once. So the impact, particularly on children and young people, is something which is quite profound. It's scary, in fact. And it's the one area perhaps that I find, as a counsellor and working in the field, and maybe, you know, it's the one area where perhaps I find it hard to keep my professional hat on, in the sense that I can find an anger at times in myself whenever I'm brought face to face with how a youngster or a child is affected. It's hard to it's not easy to see that, because it's very, very real. So yes, the addiction isn't just the business or the problem for the addict. It spreads like the ripple in the pond. It spreads out wider and beyond them.
What's the common behaviors that come up for people with addiction? Is there like a common theme with drink, drugs, gambling, or does each kind of addiction have its own? Like for when I say with the family dealing or the partners that are dealing with that type of behavior.
I suppose I could put it very simply, Ryan. You know, denial, lying, cheating. Those are a few things that, you know, a person will, when they realize that their problem is a problem and they don't want people to know about it, then they will try to hide it. So that can be either physically hiding bottles around the house or out in the hedge or wherever, going into the car. It's denial, as in, you know, no, I'm not, or I wasn't. It's downright lies, you know, in that sense. So what that does, it breaks down trust. Trust gets broken, and people don't know what to believe. There's anger, there's aggression. That often comes with addiction. It may not necessarily be physical all the time, but there's usually verbal aggression, and that can be as hurtful and as damaging as many things, as other types of violence. So there's that. There's a breakdown of a relationship. There's the inability to complete things. So people who are caught up in addiction, you know, might say, I'm going to do this now, I'll do this next week, or I'm going to start this course, or I'm going to do that job, and it doesn't get finished. So it affects a person at all sorts of different levels. But it's not easy being around someone. And what I mean, you know, in terms of the differentiation between different types of alcohol or drugs, what I've noticed, and I suppose colleagues of mine notice, is that you know, alcohol, it takes time for usually a problem with alcohol to develop into an addiction in a person's life. It doesn't usually happen in the space of months. It takes longer. But what we are noticing, especially in the last number of years, is that with the growth in cocaine use, people are getting into difficulty in their lives with cocaine much quicker than they would with alcohol. It seems to accelerate the whole process of addiction, and that's particularly worrying because of the fact that there is. I'm sure you've heard, and most people are aware, that there's just been a huge increase in the use and availability and acceptability around cocaine, and I don't think we fully understand what the you know, the implications of all that are going to be. So gambling is a very difficult addiction. Not that there's any easy addictions, but I refer to it as a very sticky addiction in that, with drugs or drink, you usually physically see it on somebody in some way, their behavior changes. Whereas with gambling, a person, obviously, it may not show on them as such, but yet they've become so deceitful. They've learned to weave a web of lies that they almost don't recognize they're doing it themselves. And it changes their personality in that sense. So, yeah, there's a whole change of person. It's not just about the substance in the bottle or the drug that they're using. It's about what it's doing to a person at a deeper, if you like, spiritual level. Mm-hmm. It's changing them as a human being. And I suppose recovery is about, once they get stabilized, it's about really coming back to themselves and coming back to a deeper appreciation of themselves.
Yes. I would say I've had a gambling addiction when I was about 18. I had I don't know, I had like a few grand, maybe I think I maybe 7-8 grand saved, and I worked in the bookies at the time. But one of the guys who was working for the bookies, he would come in and he would tell me of what he was winning online, and I was like, Jesus, that sounds great, So I thought I'll try that out, and beginner's luck, as they say. Had a little luck, won, but then started to go the other way.
Yes.
And then I was just in this cycle of constantly losing and trying to chase it back, losing and trying to chase it back.
Yeah.
And I gambled all my money. Mm-hmm. And then I was working week to week, gambling that money. And then it went as far as gambling in the bookies.
Yeah.
And like to the point where I had no money. I'd lost it all. And gambling the money in the bookies to try and gamble my money back. I'd eventually lose my job because I shouldn't have been doing what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I knew that was going to happen. I just knew this is not going to end well. But I was so deep in that addiction of trying to chase the loss that I didn't know how to get out of it. The only way to get out of it was to have no money. And when that hit, I was like, okay, I can't do that anymore. It was hard for the first few weeks. I remember I was going online and you could block yourself. It was like Betfair.
Yes.
I'm sure you know of it. You could block yourself for so many weeks, and I would do that. And then I'd set up another account, but then that new account would be blocked straight away. Yeah. And it was just so hard. That feeling of like wanting to gamble again was really, really tough. But ultimately, I just had to go cold turkey. And a few weeks later, I knew at the time that it was really hard. But I knew in the long run that this was a really good lesson for life. I could have had a lot more when I was a bit older, and it could have been more detrimental. But to learn that lesson at that time, I think served me very well. Yeah. And I don't gamble anymore. I see, for me, I look at gambling as a fool's game. And I was that fool. It brought me to a really dark place that I didn't like.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I mean, there's different forms of gambling. There's a gambling as most people understand it, which is like, the bookies or online and stuff like that, and putting money on whatever. But I suppose gambling and that idea of risk reward, if I risk this, I'll get that. That takes on other forms too, doesn't it? In terms of, people, people investing money in some quick reward thing, shares, invest in this, that, or the other. But it is very addictive. And what you're describing there, that even though you knew it wasn't going to end well, it was almost like you couldn't help yourself at that point in time. And I suppose that the common sort of theme that gambling shares with other addictions is this idea that I can control, that I'm in control, that I can, in some point or other, if I do this, I'll get that outcome. Whereas when you cross that line, that invisible line into addiction, you've lost control. You are, in that sense, you've lost that power. And that's the hardest thing for a lot of people to come to understand and accept that they've become powerless. I suppose it's like, you might have heard of the 12 steps, which is used in AA and those things. It's one of these old, I say old, it goes back to, they were framed back in the 1930s, but they would be used by a lot of people in recovery, particularly in alcohol addiction. The 12 steps, they're called. And we would utilize them also in our work. But the first step is, we admit it, we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. And the two key themes there are powerlessness and unmanageability. Recognizing that that's where you've got to, and accepting that that's where you've got to. And that's, I think, a big hurdle for a lot of people to come to get to that point where they're no longer, if you like, playing the game or pretending that they can control or manage the situation, that they can't. And in that sense, like, they've got to raise their white flag and say, right, I'm beat by this. It's got me beat. But that can take time and sometimes takes a lot of pain to get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah, like I feel like I had a cocaine addiction too.
Right.
Know? So I in my 20s, I drank, a social drinker, drank every weekend. Well, most weekends, I would say. But cocaine was very accessible too. So like I wouldn't have done one without the other. So my whole 20s, it was like, it was drink and cocaine. But I could never go out without cocaine. It just became one. They just became one. It's kind of the way it was, and and
that's not unusual.
Yeah.
I mean, again, what I would hear. I mean, I'm not in a sort of heavy social scene myself, so I wouldn't be all that familiar. But certainly, from the people that I work with, the people coming through our doors, and they're people in their 20s, 30s, and upwards. They would talk about cocaine being the sort of if you like, the accelerant. It helps to keep the party going.
It does.
And so when they're beginning to flag at 12 o'clock at night or 1 in the morning, cocaine then gives that boost, extra sense of energy. And, again, for a lot of people, it may seem to be kind of harmless or whatever. But, when you begin to recognize that the dependence that you develop on that's where then it becomes problematic. And when you mix actually the two, you introduce a new substance, cocaethylene, which is a mixture of the alcohol and the cocaine, and that the cocaethylene actually can have long term pretty bad physical consequences. So.
Yeah, that's probably what I really enjoyed then, that mixture. But what I realized is whenever I was able to stop doing cocaine, drinking just faded away from me.
Right.
So I stopped doing cocaine. I drank, but I didn't really drink that much then. I didn't really drink to get drunk. And then it just became easier and easier to I drank less and less, and then I drank less frequent. But it just kind of happened very fast, like over the space of a few months, and to the point where I drank very little, and now I don't drink much at all. But at the time too was what I was dealing with in life, which I've talked about on previous podcasts. But and now I have a funny relationship with drink. I might have a few drinks now and then, but I'm wild hard on myself when I do. I think it's because the memories that I have with it, and the association that I had. So sometimes I struggle to enjoy it.
Yeah, well, when you think about it, and I mean, I'm not in recovery, and I can have a drink at times, and I wouldn't drink. I never did, even when I was younger. I think I always had a certain kind of fear of it. I didn't like that feeling of being out of control. When I was with friends or in that kind of social scene, there was something in me always didn't like the feeling when you were heavily intoxicated, that they'd been out of control. But that's what alcohol does. It alters your mood, as does the cocaine. And I think what you're describing there is, once you kind of give up one, you're actually beginning no longer to feel the need to alter your mood that way. And you maybe find other things. I don't know what you're into, but you may find other things People talk today about getting that dopamine hit or whatever, but the other ways in which you can find a sense of, whether it's relaxing or just, enjoyment or excitement or whatever. But you don't need to depend on a substance to do it for you.
Definitely.
Especially when you've maybe had experience of the negative effects of it.
Yeah. I think the way I look at it now is I've had great time, I do I look at it like I had an addiction? I don't know. I don't think so, because I still maybe not, but I still function. I showed up for my work. However, that's one of the effects it had on me, was even though I was going out the weekend, the longer I was doing it over the years, the less interested I became in my work, so I was less productive. It came to a point, because I worked for myself, that there was days that I wouldn't work until maybe Wednesday or Thursday, because I wasn't able to show up, and then I would do what I would on a Thursday and Friday, and then it would repeat. So that was the effect. So that's why now it's like, even not feeling right, in the sense of a few drinks, if I feel a little bit off the next day, I'm like, nah, it just brings them back, the memories. So that's kind of it.
I think when you begin to kind of realize that it interferes with other things that you want to do or enjoy, then you begin to recalculate the thing. And and you feel no longer the need to do it, and I think the social scene has changed again. I think that the actual figures shown about alcohol consumption, for example, in Ireland among young people has dropped.
I read that.
Yeah, it is. I don't have the precise figures, but the people who gather all that sort of data would say that, in Ireland, among sort of younger people in the sort of 18 to 30 segment or whatever, they're not drinking in the same way or the same volume as maybe older generations would have done at that time.
Yeah.
So I think there is a bit of a change happening there.
I think that percentages, don't quote me on it, but it's the amount the alcohol being consumed now versus like maybe 20 years ago is 20% less.
Yeah.
Which is a huge amount.
It's a big difference, yeah.
But I think young people are just more aware of like the effects of alcohol.
Yeah, I think so. I think they've there's been a lot of sort of public health information about all this stuff, and I think it's just they're more clued in.
Have you any like stories on people who have been through that kind of stick out to you? Ones that kind of like are ones that are like shocking, or like people who've been through your program or through the center where they've really changed their lives, or they've had moments where it's like the penny dropped? And
I mean, that's one of the great things about working where I do, is that you sometimes, you get a kind of a front row seat on a person's journey to some extent. I mean, they're only with us 4 weeks, but they're connected to the place. If they're in recovery and doing well, we usually will have them connected to us for a longer period of time. And you do at times come across people, and I'm thinking of someone who came to us when he was about 21 or 2. And he had, it was alcohol, but mainly cocaine, and he used other drugs. And I suppose because he was relatively young, I remember myself having kind of, I say doubts, but I was thinking, this is going to be tough for this young lad, trying to turn his life around, because, he has to go back out there and deal with life. And I remember him struggling, but he went on then from us to avail of further help and support and treatment elsewhere, and then went back to education. And he just began to develop a completely different way of life. And we keep in touch every so often. And over the last few years, one of the things that he's been doing, which to me is a real kind of indication of the growth that has taken place in him and his whole life, is he's begun to go out to Africa through some connections that he had, and he's going out to work in pretty bleak circumstances, with young people and supporting charities out there. He'll go out maybe for a couple of months of the summer, and doing all of this just off his own bat. He's not part of any big organization. He just has. I suppose what he's discovered is he has the courage and the sense, and I suppose confidence, to be able to do something like that, and to realize that it's entirely possible for him to do it. And that's only happened because he's come on his own journey. He had to deal with the fact that he was hurting people. And one of the things, I suppose, that stands out for me, I remember him talking about this, was that when he was in the midst of his own addiction and he was dealing in drugs in order to feed his own habit, he talked about going to a door of a flat or apartment somewhere to collect a debt of a young woman, and knocking on the door, looking for the money. And he described standing at the door, watching her going into her living room, whatever it was, in order to search around for money to give to him. And she had to step over her infant child who was on the floor. And, he said it was obvious that she had very little. And he says when she came out with the money, whatever it was, to give to him to pay the drug debt, he couldn't help but feel that, he says, that it was like he was taking that money out of the mouth of that child. He was denying that child what the child needed. And it's a story that I've remembered and will always remember, because to me it sort of captured how, not only the nature of addiction, which is where people suffer, but that essentially these were good people, but they'd been brought to extreme circumstances in their lives. Both the woman who was in debt and needed drugs and whatever, and he who was a dealer, but he also was feeding his own habit. And the great thing is that when he got into recovery, and began to become more stable, is that he's become now an advocate in helping other people, and has certainly done that. I know that from my own experience through others, that he has helped other people in that regard. And those are powerful stories of not just recovery from addiction, but of how the human spirit can recover, and how people come back to who they really are deep down. And when you witness that, and that always obviously encourages the like of myself and others in what we do. It helps us cope with the difficult days, because there are other stories which are sad stories as well. And I'm not going to depress you or anything, but I mean, the reality of addiction is, I've worked with people who perhaps months down the line, I've gone and stood at their coffin. And these are young, healthy human beings with huge potential, but sadly just didn't get it. And when they went back into addiction, that's where it eventually took them. I can think of one person in particular where she, I keep in my drawer at work a letter from her sister thanking us for what we did, even though, I remember going to her wake where she got to the point where she couldn't live and she took her own life. So those are the two, I suppose, the two opposite ends of the work that you do, in the sense of where addiction can take people. So both kind of, in their own way, motivate you. They Poof. That's hit me. Yeah. Ooh, I wasn't expecting that.
Why do you feel that that's hit you?
I just feel that story, that memory of that particular young woman, just sort of. I suppose it's a story and a memory I'll never forget. Just the sadness, the waste and of life, and also when you work in that field, and that's something like that happens. You do, I do certainly, and I'm sure my colleagues, you 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 feel a sense of, could we have done more? Could we have done something different? You feel it, you know. Um, yeah, and it just hit me in the stomach there. It really just hit me. Um, so it's the sadness of the waste of life, and the just a beautiful life gone. So that's why I say both kind of examples, motivate. I think all of us who work in the field, you want to avoid people going down that road. You want to do your best for people. And at the same time, also, you're pulled along and you're encouraged by the people that you see doing well. And, they encourage other people so much so. But it's a difficult world, to be in, because it's about human life and there is so much at stake. There is so much at stake here for everyone involved.
Why do you feel like life has brought you to this place, working with people, helping people?
Has life brought me to this point?
Why do you feel life has brought
Why do
you
I feel?
here?
Yeah, I do think. Yeah, I think life has brought me to this. I worked at various things over the years, but I suppose most significantly, I spent over 20 years as a priest, Catholic priest, and in that work and that role, living that way, a lot of it was about being with people and dealing with people in all the different circumstances of their lives. And I suppose it also gave me an insight into the brokenness in human beings. Because quite often people would have turned to you when they were struggling in their lives for whatever reason. And there was an openness there. They were looking for help and they were reaching out. And I suppose I've always felt, in that sense, drawn towards that type of work or that way of life. Just simply, yeah, I see it both as something that I feel drawn towards, and I feel also a great sense of privilege about it, because the years in the priesthood where, there's a lot of different aspects to it, but essentially you're really trying to accompany people on their own journey. You're walking with people to an extent, and that, I suppose, gave me an appreciation of the fact that we all are, we're human beings. And the word human comes from humus, in the Latin word, which means earth, and we are fragile human beings. So, getting into the world of addiction, treatment and recovery and all of that, in some ways, that the years spent in priesthood were a preparation for that. Obviously, it's different work, but it still brings me into that kind of encounter with people in their lives and in their stuff.
Two questions on that. Like, what inspired you to become a priest, and then what inspired you to leave the priesthood?
Getting into the priesthood, I suppose it's hard to put my finger on exactly what it was that inspired me. In the world that I grew up in Derry, as a child, and my family, faith, religious faith, was very important, and the work that a priest did was kind of recognised as important and valued. And so I suppose growing up as a child, as a young person, I saw that, and I saw it as something that was worthwhile and noble. And I suppose at a certain point in my life, maybe late teens or early 20s, I kind of was figuring out what I want to do with myself. I actually worked in a bank for a few years, and I found that quite sort of mundane and ordinary and not all that life-giving. So my thoughts then settled on the idea of becoming a priest. But when I went to study for it, I was far from convinced that I wanted to become. I just thought I'd go along and test it out. But then I got drawn into it and more, and then got ordained a priest and worked in parishes. So it wasn't that any particular person, that inspired me as such. But I just believe in the journey of life, that I was meant in some way to go that way. Even though then I decided then to leave the priesthood. And to answer the question, what inspired me to leave? Well, the reality was I was in a relationship with a woman who's now my wife. And, it got to a point where I felt I have to make a decision here. I have to make a choice. I wasn't being fair either to her or to the people I was working with, and I needed to make a decision, and deciding to leave and make that choice, in a sense, it wasn't a difficult choice, and thankfully, we're now married and we have a life together, and I feel very fortunate in that sense, because I love my wife, and that's been a great gift as well for me. But the transition away from priesthood into a different way of life, it's like any major transition in life. It's difficult, and in Ireland, I suppose there was always that sense of, you're known. I would have been known as a priest, and then when you step out of it, you leave that world behind, and that can be a big adjustment to make. And sometimes part of that adjustment is dealing with how other people may feel about it. And I would say with my parents, for example, they struggled with that. There was a sense of loss for them. Now they've passed away, but that part was painful for them, and it was, I suppose, painful for me to witness it. But we got through it, But I see all of this as just been part of the journey of life, and I don't in any way look back and sort of regret any of it. It's all been part of it.
Stephen, thank you very much. I've really, 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 really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very insightful to see the amazing work that you're doing with the people in White Oaks. It's really, really something. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Been a pleasure.
Well.